Hey guys, Jay here. So the Atlante 4 speakers from Revival Audio is a new speaker from relatively a new company, a new kid on the block. But interestingly, the speaker designer behind this brand was the late Daniel Emont, who was a designer with an extensive resume having designed speakers for Focal, dynaudio, and altec lansing, to name a few. And we can see that in the parts of the design. For example, much like the legendary Esotar tweeters from dynaudio, the slightly bigger than an inch soft dome tweeter on the Atlante 4 is not just an average off-the-shelf soft dome tweeter, but all designed in-house in France with their patented technology like this Air ID, which is this little thing sitting on the backside of the tweeter that you normally wouldn't see unless you took apart the tweeters like I did. According to Revival Audio, 95% of the standing waves can be absorbed by this ARID without having to use heavy traditional damping material, which allows them to extend the high frequency further. Now, this is a three-way speaker, meaning you also get a mid-range driver and two dedicated bass drivers. Their 5-inch mid-range driver and two 7-inch bass drivers are also unique in that they are basalt sandwich construction. Basalt, however you want to call it, is basically a lava stone, found in various parts of the world in large quantities and therefore very sustainable. But also, according to Revival Audio, this material has a stronger Young modulus compared to Kevlar and glass fiber. A higher Young modulus essentially means that it's stiffer and is less likely to bend or deform, which obviously helps with things like distortion. Now, I'm not too sure about the claim from Revival Audio, however, because according to the web, basalt has a Young modulus rating of 78 to 110 gigapascal, which is stronger than glass fiber with 72 gigapascal, however, less stronger than Kevlar with 130 to 179 gigapascal. It's fun to say, isn't it? Gigapascal. Or am I saying it wrong? Gigapascal. Darn it. Nevertheless, it is a good material to use in driver design because it's sustainable and less costlier than Kevlar. I simply love the aesthetic on this loudspeaker. It extrudes elegance, and quite frankly reminds me of speakers like ProAx speakers. It's really not surprising though, because Revival Audio worked closely with an award-winning design studio in France to come up with this timeless design that is a marriage between Japanese style and French style, which I think really they did a really good job of that. Crossover is of good quality and even uses WBT binding post and Vanden Hall Skyline cables for the internal wiring of the speaker. But honestly, I've seen better parts being used at this price point of $4,300, but I also understand that a lot of the budget went into the driver design and the cabinet, a little bit more so than the crossover. I will say though, I would have personally liked to seen better parts in the crossover rather than fancy internal cables. This speaker is 89 dB in sensitivity with a nominal impedance of 4 ohms with minimal impedance dipping to 3.2 ohms, which means that this speaker isn't really terribly hard to drive, but you would still benefit from a quality amplifier that can handle those low impedance loads for certain passages in your music. I've tried numerous different types of amplifiers with this speaker in the time I had with it, and even though tube integrated amplifiers like the Cayenne Jazz 80, Bruno Terra, and Triangle Art i20 all sounded pretty darn good, I personally prefer the more robust bass control and textures and thought it sounded best with gear like my AGD Audion Monoblocks, the Galleon TS820, and the Hagel H400. The overall sound signature of this speaker is similar to the Atlante 5 speakers I have reviewed in the past, with a slight V-shaped sound, meaning elevated bass and elevated treble. However, while it was evident to me that the high frequency was slightly elevated, I didn't feel that it was fatiguing. Perhaps due to the dips around certain areas like 7 kHz region, for example, which can be attributed to vocal sibilance, especially those S's, the S, which is something I'm particularly sensitive to. The upper treble is where I definitely did notice a boost in high frequency that did make some recordings sound a little more livelier. And while some modern recordings were just a touch too hot for my personal liking, most of the tracks actually sounded really good without harshness. Once again, perhaps due to the selected dips in the frequency response. For me, instead of being harsh, it just simply kind of elevated the more spacious presentation, the spaciousness of the speaker, which I obviously very much liked. The mid-range is actually pretty linear. It's about plus minus 3 dB, even though it doesn't quite look like it because this graph is really zoomed in. But overall, it aligned with my personal subjective opinion of the mid-range, which I found to be quite nicely balanced and really nothing really popping out at you. Again, nicely balanced. You hear every vocal and instruments in a balanced, natural way. And I really love the tone on the mid-range on this loudspeaker. It just seemed natural and easy to listen to. At the same time, again, very easy to discern different things like instruments and vocals, as nothing is elevated or, recessed too much. It was more or less, I found to be, again, balanced, natural, easygoing. And talking about easygoing, I did find the mid-range to be slightly warm and muscular sounding. Although I wouldn't categorize as a full, luscious, thick sounding mid-range, nor lean. It sits somewhere in between. It's, again, nicely balanced. So it's not too thin, it's not too thick, and I personally really like the natural presentation of the mid-range on this speaker. If you know me, I'm not really a particular fan of this V-shaped sound, as sometimes it can sound like the mid-range is sucked out or recessed. But I didn't really get that sensation with this speaker. It's one of those rare scenarios where I did enjoy a V-shaped sound from a speaker. So when it comes to a V-shaped sounding speaker like the Audiophile 4s here, there is a clear advantage when it comes to low-level listening. The reason for that is because us humans actually are less sensitive to the extreme frequencies, meaning the really high frequency and the really low frequencies at lower volumes especially, we're less sensitive to those frequencies. Which means with a speaker like this that has a little bit of boost in the bass and a little bit of boost in the highs, does give a more balanced sound at lower volumes, making it perfect for those applications in small spaces or for those that don't crank up their music too much, and also those that want to listen at late at night and still get that full bass and treble presence all at the same time without having to crank up the volume. Now once again, when it comes to the bass, it is elevated. And that gives perhaps the little bit of warmth and muscular textures that I heard in the mid-range as well. But this speaker has serious bass capabilities. Now, what you're seeing here is a quasi-anechoic response, which means that it's a snapshot of the speaker's frequency only without the room equation. So once you put the speaker into the room with a little bit of room gain, this is pretty much a full-range loudspeaker that you don't quite need a subwoofer for. Even though I would always recommend subwoofers for room nodes, which is a different topic for a different day. Again, the overall texture and the tightness of the bass is balanced. I personally wouldn't describe the bass of the speaker to be the most fast or tactile bass I've ever heard, nor would I describe it as slow or sluggish. However, if I have to put my finger on it, I would say that the bass sounds more towards the muscular and rich sounding bass rather than tactile, fast, tight, and clinical sounding bass. The soundstage is really nice and big, although I did find that the soundstage was wider than deep on this specific loudspeaker. Now this wide soundstage was very impressive. The spatial cues, the layering, and the instrumental separation within that wide soundstage that stretched past plane of the speakers was very impressive. And I attribute this partially to the elevated high frequency. And that may sound weird, what does boosted high frequency have to do with sound staging? But I personally found that especially past 10 kilohertz when it's elevated slightly, I did find that speakers that have that elevation to have this more airy spatial cues, giving me a more atmospheric kind of experience in the soundstage. Of course, not on every speaker that is elevated in the high frequency, but with certain speakers, that's done right. Setting up this speaker is not hard, but there are some things to watch out for. Firstly, this speaker has a pretty good off-axis horizontal response and a standard roll-off in the high frequency as you tow them away from your ears. And more or less, it keeps that sound profile, the overall tone, even when you're towing it out into the room. So my recommendation would be to have minimal tow-in, if possible, tow it out to the room, and based on that, start towing it in and see how you like it. Especially pay attention to the treble level and what suits your taste with how much treble you're getting. You do have to be conscious of the amount of space you give the speaker from the wall behind the speakers. I would say about 2 to 3 feet since the speaker is ported, and that gave me a good result and balance of depth and width of the soundstage. However, if you must put the speaker closer to the wall, then you do have foam plugs that comes with the speakers that you can plug the ports with to tame that bass. I would recommend trying to plug the bottom port first, as that really took care of my problems when I had it closer to the wall. Although I will always recommend sitting on axis to the tweeter level, because some people have different sofas and sitting arrangements, I understand that that may not be always the case. So I tested the speaker to see if sitting below the tweeter level is going to be okay. And it turns out it's fine and not critical. But once again, I would personally have the tweeters on axis to my ears if at all possible. Now, what you don't want to do is sit above the speaker's tweeter level. Here are the measurements showing that, and it starts to dip pretty heavily around 3.5 kilohertz or so. Now, I don't really imagine that people are going to be sitting above the height of the speakers, but on certain applications, for let's say home theater, where you have multiple rows of seats going up and up and up, that may be a problem. And for those applications, I wouldn't recommend this speaker. So who is this speaker for? So I think firstly, if you heard or owned dynaudio speakers and ever thought to yourself, well, I wish the high frequency was a little bit more open, a little bit more livelier with spatial cues popping out at me, I think that this speaker is worth the demo. Or alternatively, you have a lively, detailed, spacious sounding speaker and you like the details and the spaciousness, but find it a little bit fatiguing, I think this speaker is also a good bet because once again, I did find the high frequency to be open and spacious, but I didn't find it quite as fatiguing as many other speakers that I found to have that V-shaped sound. Also, if you are an individual that cares about, the company having in-house capabilities and having that attention to detail without getting the price too crazy, because companies that have that capability tends to have their speakers pretty expensive, like Sonos Faber, Wilson Audio, Magico, and so on, etc. So without the price getting too crazy and having in-house capability is pretty impressive. And so if you value that, I think you would probably love this brand. Now, my current reference in this price range is the Arendal 1723 THX Towers, which is about $4,000. And this is a list available for my Patreons on my Discord page that is always updated every time I review a speaker. It either replaces the speaker in the category or it doesn't. And this one was particularly hard for me. I must have gone back and forth multiple times. The Revival Audio does have a spacious sound, the width of the soundstage that I didn't quite get with the Arendal 1723 tower speakers. If you remember my review of that speaker, that was my single criticism. Both of these speakers have incredible bass capability, although I would argue that the Arendals have a slight edge in bass tuning because they have 3 ports that's meant to be plugged in different orientations for different bass response depending on your room. Both of these speakers mid-range is really enticing and really natural and easy to listen to. Although again, I would say the Arendal 1723 THX Towers that I love so much is more easier to listen to multiple different types of music because it's overall more balanced in the entire spectrum of the frequency response. After some real thoughts going into this, like really overthinking, I think I'm gonna stay with my Arendals because with the Arendals, because it's 92 dB in sensitivity, more sensitive than the Revival Audio, I can run it with various different tube amplifiers. And I've seen success in opening up that soundstage as I recommended in my review as well of this speaker. I can get that soundstage with tube amplifier, although not quite exactly like the Revival Audio, and I'll miss that. But there's so much I love about the Arendals already that I think the trade-off is worth it, at least for me. Really, both of these speakers are great speakers, and it's gonna depend on what type of sound you are looking for. One thing I really do prefer on the Revival Audio is definitely going to be that sexy looking cabinetry, which I absolutely 100% more prefer over the Arendal's aesthetics. So that's pretty much it from me. I hope this video was enjoyable and entertaining. And if it was, please subscribe and click the like button on this video. And I'll see you guys on my next video. Until next time.